Hello there, and welcome once again to Rebuilding the Collection, or Journeys with Jazz in Lockdown. I'm Paul Palmer. We are still going through my old cassette tape collection of jazz albums, garnered in the dim and distant days of youth, and happened upon in lockdown like a veritable treasure trove. And we're deciding which albums to either bin or retain in digital form. And speaking of treasure, glimmering through the tarnish from down the line in Houston, Texas, is the man I've enlisted to help me with this onerous task, Mr. Eric Blackman, my one-time colleague and my friend. Hello, Eric.
Hello, Paul. How are you doing?
Great. Well. How about yourself?
It's at this point in time, it's a very long story, but fun.
Okay. Well, one day we may even get to hear that story. We'll never know. A reminder that we're discussing my cassette collection by album title in alphabetical order, which allows us to discuss different albums from the same artist in different episodes. Our last episode, we finished off discussing albums with names beginning with B. At least I thought so, but I have discovered another B, which we'll talk about in a second. But we are going to include some albums beginning with C as well. Okay, so let's talk about this album I discovered, which is on the list. It's called Bird Symbols. It's by the artist Charlie Parker. And we have to talk about it a bit because it is a compilation, really. And I have said that we'll do compilations in a separate show, but I am going to make an exception in this case because this includes Charlie Parker's recordings from the Verve label in the late 40s, and it's over a limited period of time. It's not like sampling his whole oeuvre, which would have differed from the start to the end of his career. This is a contained amount of time. It came out in 1961. It's called Bird Symbols, and it's on the actual album is on the Summit album, or sometimes the Rhapsody album. Okay, so we will discuss that one, Charlie Parker, Bird Symbols, and we'll go on to the C's as well. So let me give you those. We've got Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers, and this one's called Caravan, and it came out on Riverside in 1963. We've got Coleman Hawkins and Ben Webster, and that's called Coleman Hawkins Encounters Ben Webster. That's came out on Verve in 1959. And John Coltrane, Coltrane Sound, came out in 1964 on Atlantic. And finally, Dollar Brand, The Children of Africa, came out on Enja in 1976. So, Eric, what do you think of those albums?
I think they're all, without exception, exceptional, wonderful. I can't do without them. My motto is a jazz vinyl album a day, listened to by myself, keeps the doctor away.
Really, most people say that about apples, but I can't disagree with you. Jazz does help, but I'm doing away with the vinyl, as you know. Well, not necessarily the vinyl. I just haven't got anything to play them on, and these cassette tapes, we've got to get rid of them, aren't they? They're just lumps of plastic, just cluttering up the place.
Well, I have a problem with the cassette tapes. I always fear that the tape will break that while in the machine, or I can't get the tape out of the machine, and so on and so forth. But regarding the albums, I mean, they're all spectacular, and I have an image in my head of two Charlie Parker Verve albums I have. I think it's called Charlie Parker #1, Charlie Parker #2 on Verve from whenever the albums came out. And it's just such a glorious picture, image of Charlie Parker on the cover, and classic Charlie Parker, amongst from the heyday of all his tunes, which as a saxophone player are in the Charlie Parker Omnibook.
Well, it sounds like a couple of albums that should be on my list of C's because I don't have those. Perhaps we should put put those in as well, you know. But certainly bird symbols, which I think we should talk about now, is a great a great Shirley. Well, I say a great. It's not necessarily uh, a particularly good acoustic sound on these albums. The sound quality isn't great. Um, they're in mono for a start, and although they may have been remastered in some way, but I'm not sure. But my version is in mono and a bit grainy sounding. But I mean, you can't take away from the absolute treasures that these Parker compositions are. Well, you got. I'm not going to go through the entire track listing, but you've got Moose the Moose, Yardbird Suite, Night in Tunisia, a few standards, Embraceable You, Out of Nowhere, Don't Blame Me, absolute, you know, the bedrock of good jazz. You know these tracks? Have you heard any of
Yes,
them?
absolutely. And as soon as you said Moose the Mooch, the other day I was listening to a recording I've got from the late 1970s, the great jazz drummer Mel Lewis with Freddie Hubbard and Michael Brecker doing Moose the Mooch as a samba. They treat the head as a samba, but then they kick it into swinging it very hard. So Charlie Parker, when you speak of the sound recording and the mono and the crackling and all of that, I remember being dismissive of that and that turning me off years and years and years and years ago. But back then I was eating McDonald's and Pop-Tarts. I've stopped eating McDonald's and Pop-Tarts, and I don't get at all bothered by older poor sound recordings, because it's all part of the flavor, picture, and history of jazz.
Absolutely, yeah. So this on this album, there I think some examples of what Parker was known for, taking heads and traditional heads or tunes and just soloing over them, or and creating a highly sort of elaborate version of it, and presenting that as this. He's called it something else, like Bird of Paradise, which is on this. Is I'm pretty sure it's All the Things You Are,
Yes.
but it's completely redone head, so it's soloed over it. He's done that throughout his career, hasn't he?
Yes, I was working with a student the other day on what had been How High the Moon, which is Charlie Parker wrote his head ornithology and doubled or more the tempo.
Yeah, yeah. And you know, there's a variety of artists who appear on Miles Davis, Max Roach, Errol Garner, and there are others who I couldn't possibly name. I can't. It doesn't really go into details as to who's on, because it's a compilation, I guess. So let's talk about the bop style. He doesn't play as fast and as furious on these late 40s tracks, but this bop style is very much in evidence. Fast playing, sometimes, you know, really floridly over these changes. What do you make of the bop style?
It was a revolution. My understanding was that I started to read about a while back was that these guys were not drafted during the war years, World War II. They were a little bit older. And by these guys, Charlie Parker, Bud Powell, Thelonious Monk, Kenny Clark, and all those people who, in spite of being from elsewhere in the United States, all migrated to New York. And they were not only revolutionizing jazz, but setting the stage for New York to be the epicenter for jazz from the end of World War II to this very day. So what they were doing obviously was jam sessions, and consciously and unconsciously, wittingly and unwittingly, doing as they pleased with old jazz standards and with originals, and picking up the tempos, and to relieve their own sheer boredom of what had happened during the swing era between world wars. They were challenging themselves, and it seemed that there were comments at the time that the swing era was wearing them down, was fatiguing them. You could literally, during the swing era, not practice your instrument and be in a swing era big band and be a soloist within the big band and play that repertoire the way it was being played at the time, and you could just coast and get by. And it was occurring to some of them that they needed to be taken more seriously. They needed to take themselves more seriously, and they were inclined to do so, so they did. And the outcome was to create bop, where you had to sit down and listen to it attentively, the way you were listening to Beethoven and Stravinsky in the classical concert halls.
Yeah. I read one interview of Parker where he said it suddenly occurred to him that by he was hearing different things when he was playing the standards, and you were right, getting bored with them. But if he played the upper harmonies of certain chords, the very higher harmonies, that's where he wanted to do his improvisation, because he was hearing that sort of sound, and that's what was the bedrock to how he actually created these new tunes. It's a fascinating. You must have been practicing, you know, hours and hours to get that inner ear going like that. But it certainly comes out. So I think what we're saying is we must have this Charlie Parker album in the collection.
Absolutely.
Great. Well, let's go on. Let's take, what should we take? Well, we might as well go straight to another renowned couple of saxophone players here, although on tenor. These are Coleman Hawkins and Ben Webster. Coleman Hawkins encounters Ben Webster. Now, I have to say, I don't really, or didn't listen to a lot of Coleman Hawkins, Ben Webster. I've obviously had the tape, and years ago I was listening to it, but I haven't sort of caught up on listening to this. But what do you make of this particular album? It's Verve 1959, yeah.
Well, I did not listen to any Coleman Hawkins or Ben Webster way back in the day. I started with Coltrane, but I worked my way back, and Coleman Hawkins is the father of jazz tenor playing. So as a jazz tenor saxophone player, to go back and actually more so than ever during this pandemic and really closely listen to Coleman Hawkins. I've got a wonderful album of Coleman Hawkins with some of the Duke Ellington band, and the great baritone saxophone player Harry Carney, the spectacular alto player Johnny Hodges, and to listen to him in some of these settings and other settings, and to re-examine, having traveled a further distance myself, musically and instrumentally, to the men who started jazz tenor, the whole thing, Coleman Hawkins, is revelatory. His style and his command for the instrument was beyond extraordinary, and he was an innovator. There was no template for him. He was obviously born of immense talent and did extraordinary work to bring it to fruition. And in the earliest days of Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington, whom he was both associated with, they helped put him on the map. He helped put the tenor saxophone on the map. So when we fast forward now to in the 50s, because he was very active in the 60s into the early 70s, Coleman Hawkins and Ben Webster are lucky for us all, as so often happens. They survive their early experiences to live through their own middle and later periods, so that we can all be reminded of where it all came from. So whether it's the giant amongst giants, Dexter Gordon, who's a centerpiece for my own experience or Lester Young, or Chu Berry, Herschel Evans, people before World War II, let alone Rollins and Coltrane after. I mean, everybody tips their hat, more so than just tipping their hat, to Coleman Hawkins. And Ben
Absolutely.
Webster as well. Ben Webster is bringing a romantic side and a little bit of an idiosyncratic side that always works to jazz and to tenor saxophone. So that whole tenor saxophone lineage, just like the trumpet lineage, chronology of great players pushing it all forward, is all there.
An important part of history, these two then, obviously, in jazz history. Let's have a look at some of the tracks. Again, some standards. It Never Entered My Mind. You'd Be So Nice to Come Home To, Cole Porter. I suppose the tracks I like are Coleman Hawkins' own one, Blues for Yolanda. It's a lovely blues. It kind of announces itself as the main first track on the album. You just hear this lovely blues. And then there's La Rosita, which is a Latin-inspired number.
Yes.
So once again, we've got. I'm not. This album isn't going anywhere. It's not going in the bin. It's going on. I'm going to put it on one of my favorite hard drives or CDs. So we've got to press on, I fear. So where shall we go next? We'll take a change of direction, I think. We'll go to Dollar Brand, The Children of Africa. Now, Dollar Brand, South African. This came out in '76. South African pianist. The album itself. Oh, by the way, he was a religious musician and later became Abdullah Ibrahim, and a lot of his music is imbued with his religiosity, and here he is playing piano on this mainly. What do you make of Dollar Brand?
Well, for me, inevitably, I had to come up to speed about this stuff. It wasn't a part of my early or middle period experiences. And first hearing it, I can't help but have been struck by how it was a whole new thing. It's not coming out of straight ahead jazz, where I'm rooted. It's not coming out of American straight ahead jazz, where I'm especially rooted. And I mean, now, here you see an old white guy. So the township experience and the South African experience was something I wasn't very familiar with. On the other hand, it did me a stupendous favor to help open up the world of jazz. Because as I'm always telling people, only 4% of the human family lives in the United States. The 96% that live elsewhere and like living there, it's beyond worthwhile to acquaint yourself with their experience. So Dollar Brand opens up a huge door to the jazz experience outside of straight ahead stuff.
Yeah, what can we say then? The first track out is kind of very florid township style, a bit of gospel influence, I would say. Then we have the second track, which kind of is more sort of florid and more modal. In the third track, Ishmael, he sings a prayer, an Islamic prayer, and then plays a little bit of soprano sax. It's a very spiritual number. as you say, it widens your perception of what jazz is, and at times he's very experimental with what he plays. It almost sounds like until you maybe listen to it a bit more, it sounds like a cat sort of scrambling over the keyboard, but and maybe that's evocative of something. But other times it's very, very soulful and tuneful.
Well, I
So
think the big musical personalities, of which he is one, make it musically and aesthetically work. So for me, it was a brand new experience, but it instantly, simultaneously, musically and aesthetically worked. So that's what I mean by, I think he opens a huge, big, wide door.
so once again, I think this isn't one I'm going to pitch. It's going to be there in the collection,
Excellent.
and we have to, I fear, move on a pace. So I think we'll go to Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers Caravan. Now, Art Blakey, such a mercurial figure. Many musicians fighting like cats in a sack to get into this group. But this is, to me, this has got to be a classic, hasn't it? And it's got, Freddie Hubbard, the likes of Freddie Hubbard, Wayne Shorter, who's in the rhythm section. Can't quite remember it right now, but I'll try and dig that out. But what do you make of Art Blakey?
I can't live without Art Blakey. This time period and all the time periods of his recorded history. Blakey is defining in practice hard bop, because people often ask, well, if Charlie Parker and his associates are bebop that burst on the scene, very fresh and vital, then inevitably, as it would travel along, I suppose at some point, the very late 50s, second half of the 50s, maybe it was slow to show itself, comes hard bop, Horace Silver, Art Blakey. Definitely, when you compare it to what happened earlier, they lay more deeply into these heads of tunes, and it's got a soul element to it, oftentimes.
Okay, I hadn't thought of it in that way. Basically, they're not playing at 100 miles an hour like these original beboppers, but you're saying there's a lot more, what, spirituality, would you say?
We'll take Blakey's famous Bobby Timmons tune, Moanin', which was a huge hit. It sounds spiritual. It's got it with its opening with the amen chord, the one chord to the four, back to the one. It evokes Amazing Grace and gospel music. But Blakey's got that front line, the three horn players, and he's got his own drumming style, which is, it seems to me, compared to Kenny Clarke and others of the bebop period, as a drummer, he's bringing the drums front and center. He's spurring on the horns in particular as the drummer. He's the drummer leader, and he's unabashedly seizing the reins and leading from the drums. It's spectacular.
Yeah, what standout tracks can we talk about on this album? For me, I think there's a lovely blues, and at the moment my information device is crashing all over the place. But let's talk about the "This Is for Albert," which is a perfect example of what brings out the horns standing up front and bursting into harmony, and it just then proceeding to solo. It's really a really well executed tune. Well, Sweet and Sour's a lovely tune, and the Caravan is a big sort of upfront number, which kind of announces itself really strongly. And then there's a ballad in the small wee hours of the morning. So
Yeah, I mean, they're all just fantastic. And, for me, again, another litmus test is upon hearing certain albums, like upon meeting certain people, you can't forget them.
yeah, yeah. I mean, the immensity of the people on this album as well.
Well put. Well put.
Um,
The immensity of the people. Absolutely. I think that's a common thread throughout the history of jazz, as with classical music. The immensity of the people.
we can do nothing but to say we're going to keep this one, and we've got to move on apace because time is drawing nigh. So to finish with, we'll have a look at John Coltrane and Coltrane Sound. Coming out in 1964 on Atlantic. What a lovely album this is as well. It's got some big numbers on it. The Night Has 1,000 Eyes, Central Park West, Body and Soul. Now, which one does he actually turn into? I think it is that Body and Soul one. Yeah, he turns it into a sort of perky swing number. I think we know Body and Soul as a sort of turgid ballad. Well, not turgid, but sort of sometimes very slow ballad, which
Yes.
maybe goes double time in the middle.
Yes.
But this one is perky swing. Totally different. I think he's reharmonized it as well. In the last track, Satellite, I think it is, or one of the tracks, Satellite, it's more redolent of perhaps Moment's Notice or Giant Steps, something like that, where he starts doing these patterns. Where you take 1, 3, 1, 2, 3, 5 of the scale throughout the changes at a million miles an hour, and you're thinking, crikey, I'm going to have to practice for 10 years before I even come close. Yeah. Do you know that feeling? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm going to get it in about 150 years.
when I've reincarnated 50 times, yes. So I think again we've got some good musicians. I wish I'd been more prepared for this actually, because I should have these rattling off.
Certainly, this time period, Coltrane is definitely in the throes of the great quartet, John Coltrane Quartet, and with Elvin Jones and McCoy, although the bass player is Steve Davis. In any event, Central Park West is quite an accepted, established Coltrane standard, and so of course is Equinox. I mean, some people defer the Equinox to call up at a jam session or to arrange because it's not a very notey head. And Coltrane introduces it to the world as a slower tune. I think Coltrane is their vehicles for Coltrane to further deepen his style, and the Coltrane Revolution, which is as an innovator, a stylist, a composer. There had never been anyone like him before. And he juxtaposes himself in the earliest of days to the other reigning tenor saxophone player of the day, Sonny Rollins.
Yeah.
And both had worked with Miles Davis, but Coltrane is really catching fire, and he's taking the modal kind of blues stuff followed by Milestones with Miles, and he's catching the modal ball and he's running with it further than Miles was to do during that time period. And he's it's intoxicating and beyond.
Yeah, absolutely. There's no way we can do without this album, and I must go away and listen to it more and work out what everyone's doing. Well, I think we've covered everything. I think we've spent all too little time discussing them, really, because there's more to say, isn't there, really, if you go into details. However, you'll have noticed, being a collection of my cassette tapes, this doesn't have anything really from the late 90s or maybe the 21st century, and we need to modernize ourselves. What B's and C's could come into a collection from a more modern era? And I do have something that I could recommend, and that is the album Cassandra Wilson Sings Standards. And Cassandra Wilson, a lovely diva from the 21st century, and you just need to listen to it. It's just a great album of standards.
Agreed.
Have you heard that, Eric?
Yeah, agreed. And I was somewhat familiar back in that time period, the 90s, with Cassandra Wilson. She had an album called Blue Skies, and she was an more than innovative enough, fresh voice who surrounded herself with the top jazz musicians of the day. Yeah.
Yeah, and also associated with the M-Bass Collective, actually.
M-Bass, Steve Coleman, absolutely.
So maybe we'll talk about them in later times. But if anyone listening to this program has any ideas about a jazz album which begins with a B or a C, or indeed any letter that should be in the collection that we're not covering, please let us know. We'll be adding more information about how to contact us in the details about the program. But for now, you can send us a tweet to @collectionbuild. That's all one word, @collectionbuild. Well, thanks for joining us today, and I hope you've enjoyed our deliberations. Today we've let all our albums go through, and hope that you have agreed with us. But drop us a line, as I've said, if you have anything to say about what we've said today. Next time, we'll roll on to some new alphabetical offerings. So we'll see you then. My thanks to you, Eric. Thanks for joining us. Hope you've enjoyed it.
Thank you.
And I'm Paul Palmer.